All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're off to sections 4 and 5. Quick overview of them as we progress here through chapter 1 in your books. And so section 4 really delves into the idea of pollution and what effect pollution has on things. And so pollution can come in a couple different forms. When it comes to pollution can either be in the point source form or the non-point source form. Point source is pretty straightforward. When we had the Gulf oil spill by BP, that would be a good example of a point source. One big known source that creates a large amount of pollution, By contrast, a non-point source is multiple sources. It's hard to tie to one particular thing. And so if we're talking about oil pollution from that perspective, it's a little bit of oil dripping out of all of our cars in the parking lot. We hear a lot in the news about point source and how bad it is. And yeah, it can really create some problems. The BP oil spill created a lot of environmental issues. But if we were really to investigate the idea of these two types of pollution, non-point source actually creates more overall environmental problems. When we talk about oil, more oil is spilled through non-point sources than through point sources. And it's harder to track and clean up. And so as a result, it can have a much greater impact on an environment than a point source can. But you should be aware of both of these two terms. When it comes to pollution can have a lot of negative effects. Those effects can be any one of these three things down here. The first one, it can disrupt how life support systems work. Breaking down the basic ecological interactions that exist. It can damage health and property. This is a big one. We've seen increased rates of cancer and all kinds of things in society over the last 50 years. And so human health is usually on the forefront of the conversation there. And what effects pollution is having on that is something that is continually debated, but is something that we should pay attention to. And it also can just create some nuisances. We usually think of pollution as chemical spills or something along those lines, but noise pollution is another form of pollution that can be not necessarily unhealthy in lots of ways, but it can create nuisances or unpleasant things. There's a lot of unpleasant odors, tastes, sights that come along with pollution, in addition to the environmental pieces. And so that's the last idea here as we progress forward. In section 5, how do we take care of these environmental issues? Why do we have all these environmental problems? So major causes of environmental problems. The biggest one, if you're going to nail down one thing that causes the most environmental problems, here it is right here. The number of people on this planet. Human population and population growth strip the earth of more resources, create more pollutions and problems. After that, you have wasteful and unsustainable resource use, using more than we should. In the United States, that's the most common problem. If you remember from our last video, the United States uses vastly more resources than any other country on the planet. Poverty. When people are poor, they have a tendency to do things to the environment to survive that aren't always healthy for the environment. Cutting down trees, creating problems with biological hazards, things along those lines, which we'll delve into in future chapters. Here's one that's kind of a hidden thing that happens in environmental issues. We don't always figure the cost of using a resource. The full cost of it. And what I mean by that is you take your trash and you throw it away. Well, we pay a fee for trash in Buffalo to have it disposed of in the landfill, but we don't really take into account all those other layers of potential problems. Are we polluting the air? Are we polluting the water? Does that eventually need cleaned up? And those costs don't go into that resource use initially. They come as a secondary cost somewhere along the lines down the road a ways. And then the last part is when we attempt to manage nature and we don't have a full understanding of knowledge of nature, sometimes we mis misuse nature, mismanage nature, which is a scary place to be. The other concept here in section 5, people can just have a different point of view of how nature should be handled. These worldviews, these ideas of should we use resources, should we live sustainably, those are all ideas that go to people's worldview, and it's not necessarily that one group's right or wrong, they're just coming from a different place. And so we should understand what our worldviews are. It helps us make decisions about environmental problems. So experts, those smarty smarts, have identified really 5 major things that cause environmental problems, and we just talked about those. The biggest one, population growth. Reducing population growth would solve most all of the environmental problems that you'll talk about throughout this year. Don't use too much stuff, too many of your resources. Poverty creates those problems, not taking into account all the environmental costs, and then poor knowledge of a situation. We just talked about those 5 things. Those are the major things that we have to be concerned about that cause environmental problems. When we talk about resource consumption, it's something that we have to be careful of. How much of a resource we are consuming. So we can look at that from two perspectives. One, overconsumption, and then by contrast, underconsumption. So really, both poverty and wealth can lead to environmental degradation. Overconsumption, wealth, and 2, underconsumption, poverty have a tendency to lead there. And so higher levels of consumption using more resources that are unnecessarily wasted can cause real problems for people. The term that you want to stick to with that idea is affluence, using more stuff than you should or you need to use. Again, in the United States, we do this quite commonly. Underconsumption. People who live in poverty are concerned with survival. They're not concerned about environmental impacts. They just want food and they just want to live. And those two things both create problems. So, too much money, not enough money, environmental problems. This dude, Aldo Leopold, he was one of the first environmentalists to come along and really kind of speak out. He's an environmental leader. And so he did a lot of writings and teachings. He really became one of the first guys to really promote conservationism in the United States and around the world. And so he came up with this idea of land ethics. How should we treat the earth? And it was one of the first ideas that really were formed about managing and taking care of the planet we're living on. And managing the earth, for him, was a moral issue. And so when it became a moral issue, it came up in conversation, and he kind of spurred that movement. And when we talk about that movement and those ideas, it's important to know that individuals matter. This book suggests 5 to 10% of the population has the capability of completely creating a movement and changing the way we handle things. He believed that land was supposed to be loved and respected. It was the extension of those basic ethics of a human being and how they should treat each other and the place they are around. And then when we abuse it, we don't respect the commodity that we have, the resource that we have. And so those were some of his basic ideas that first started a conversation about the morality of how we handle the environment. So those are the major concepts from Chapter 4, Section 4 and 5. See you on the next one.